So let us assume that Johnny is now ready to go to school. And Mother sends him to school, the first grade. And this is what little Johnny is expected to read. Now, mind you, Johnny comes bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He feels very intelligent, very smart. And you know how these kids are at 5 and 6. They feel smarter than the adults. And he comes to school, and his teacher has the usual look-say, sight reading, sight vocabulary teaching program, and this is what he's told to read, or to memorize, or to guess. Dick, look, Jane, look, look. See Dick, CC, OC, see Dick, OC Dick, OOO, funny, funny Dick. Well, this kid sits there. He says to he's really at a loss, and he says to himself, gee, either I'm crazy or she's crazy. This is not the way people talk. I mean, he should know. He's taught himself his own language. He's developed his auditory and verbal skills. He has a vocabulary of over 5,000 words. This is not how people talk. Gee, this school is a weird place. But Mother has said, now, Johnny, you behave yourself. You do what the teacher tells you to do. Be a good boy. And so Johnny decides, well, he's going to do what he's told to do, and he will behave himself, and he'll try to learn using, maybe there's something to this. But let us assume that Johnny is one of that 1/3 who can't make it because he does not have a photographic memory. His skills are more auditory and verbal than visual. And there are a lot of kids like that, a lot of kids who don't have photographic memories. And so at the end of the first grade, he's having real problems. And Mother is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a reading problem. And by now, Johnny feels pretty awful. I mean, he thinks, well, maybe I'm not as intelligent as I thought I was. Maybe I'm really dumb. And Mother has told Mrs. Jones, Johnny will have to stay behind. And so Johnny stays behind, and by the end of the second year, he isn't doing much better. Matter of fact, he's even doing worse. And so Mother is called to school again and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a learning disability. Johnny has dyslexia. He'll need special education. So he's put into special classes. Mother is frantic. She's saying, what's wrong with my boy? I've given birth to a defective human being. He's got a learning defect. And she goes to doctors, you know, all those doctor's appointments that are made, and he's tested and retested and over-tested. And she's told, well, he's got a real problem, you know, he's got a learning disability, and so he needs all kinds of special training. And by the end of the third grade, things don't get any better, and by then Johnny is fit to be tied. He is swinging from the rafters. He has become a behavioral problem. And so Mother again is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny may have minimal brain damage. I'm no kidding. These are the terms that are used by the minimal brain damage. In fact, if Johnny is to remain in school, he will have to take medication. And so they go back to the psychiatrists, and they go through all of the runaround, the testing and all of that, and they decide that Johnny will have to take Ritalin if he wants to go to school. And what does Ritalin do? Well, by the fourth grade, Johnny is a regular little zombie, destined to a life as a functional illiterate. Now, you see, why did Johnny become so hyperactive? Why was he such a behavioral problem? Well, this is what that method does. You know, they told us way back, even Life magazine said that something blocks the children's ability to learn. Well, you see, a child comes to school with a tremendous amount of learning energy, and now the system is going to block it. How do they do it? Well, you know, if you go back in history, you'll remember that the Chinese, you remember what the Chinese used to do to little girls' feet? In the old days, the Chinese men had a foot fetish. They liked to see adult, beautiful women hobbling around on tiny infants' feet, deformed infants' feet, if they could possibly even hobble. And so in order to create that gorgeous, deformed foot, at birth they would take strips of cloth and they would wind it around these little girls' feet to prevent these feet from growing. And they would keep these pieces of cloth, these strips of cloth on these little girls' feet until their feet came out tiny and deformed. Well, now this is what the method does to the child. Here the child comes into the classroom, his mind, his intellect just bursting with energy, and so they take the look-say method, these long strips of cloth, and begin winding it around Johnny's brain. And they wind it and wind it and wind it until they block it. So what happens to all that energy? That learning energy, it comes out physically. It comes out in the form of physical behavior, hyperactivity. That's what happens to the Johnnies. Well, now what I've described to you is something that goes on every day in America. Every year, 3 million children enter the first grade. And it breaks my heart when I realize that 1 million of them are going to go through that process that Johnny has gone through. That they are going to be deliberately crippled, mentally crippled, intellectually crippled, by a system devised to make sure that that takes place. By teachers who apparently don't know what they're doing. Either they don't know or they don't care. But the professors know. The professors know. As a matter of fact, one of the top professors of reading in America told a reporter of the New York Times when he was describing the look-say method, he said, well, we teach the children to look at a whole word so that they will see the picture. And if a child sees the word H-O-R-S-E, horse, and if that child says pony, that's okay, that's correct. Because the child is seeing something galloping. He's seeing the picture. But of course, if the child doesn't know the difference between a horse and a pony, he's in big trouble. But that's what's being told. That's what they say, without blinking an eyelash. That's the system they are using teaching children to read in America. And the results are appalling. That's the cause of functional illiteracy in America. It has nothing to do with the children. The children are perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. As a matter of fact, learning disability now is considered a handicap. These normal children. Johnny entered that school, remember, very learning able, right? Anyone who could teach himself to speak his own language is very learning able, right? 2 years in school, he's learning disabled. Interesting. You know, the Department of the federal government has become very concerned about making sure that all handicapped children get an equal educational opportunity, like, you know, normal children. And so they devised a federal program to make sure that handicapped children were given an education. Now, when they were talking about handicapped children, they meant children deaf, dumb, blind, crippled. You know, the speech impaired, the mentally retarded, the seriously emotionally disturbed, the hard of hearing and deaf, the orthopedically handicapped, the visually handicapped, multi-handicapped, deaf and blind. But you know what is now the largest single group of children in handicapped education? The learning disabled. These are perfectly normal kids who are very articulate, sometimes above average intelligence, and they are now the largest single group in special ed. As a matter of fact, and it's a growing group. In 1976, the number of learning disabled kids in these handicap programs was 796,000. In 1984, that figure was up to 1,806,000. So we're creating learning disabled kids. You know, we can't keep up with them. The schools are so successful in destroying the minds of American youngsters that, you know, they can't even keep up with them. It is now the single largest group of handicapped children under the handicap programs, a program that was devised for really handicapped children, the deaf, the dumb, the blind, the crippled. Now, the so-called learning disabled are the largest group. And in the state of California, out of 370,000 handicapped children, do you know how many are learning disabled? 207,000 in the state of California. You've got a problem in this state. I think that Dr. Honig should address this problem. I know he's very concerned about teaching evolution. I think he ought to be concerned about teaching reading. I think it's much more important to make sure that children learn to read than know about Darwin's theory. But I haven't heard that Dr. Honig is terribly concerned about this.